Before we get into this one, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me what time it is right now, wherever you're watching from, and which country you're in. I read every single one, and it's genuinely one of my favorite parts of making these videos, seeing just how far a story about a tiny rock in the middle of the ocean can travel. Speaking of which, let's talk about that rock. The storm hits without warning, the way the worst ones always do out here. And within hours, the ship's rigging is torn apart, its hull taking on water faster than anyone can bail it out. It's July 1609, and the Sea Venture, flagship of a small fleet bound for the struggling English colony at Jamestown, has been driven off course by a hurricane so violent that the crew has given up trying to save the vessel and started praying instead.
Then, through the rain, someone spots land, and the captain makes a decision that will end up mattering more than anyone on board could possibly have understood. Rather than let the ship sink in open water, he deliberately wedges it onto a ring of coral reef, close enough that every single person aboard, all 150 of them, makes it to shore alive. They've just become the first people to permanently inhabit a place so isolated that the nearest mainland sits over 1,000 kilometers away. And when they look around at their new home, they find something almost impossible to believe. No rivers, no lakes, no streams, not one single natural source of fresh water anywhere on the island. They've survived a hurricane, only to wash up on a rock that seems, at first glance, entirely incapable of keeping them alive.
To understand how that rock ended up sitting in the middle of the North Atlantic in the first place, you have to go back roughly 30 million years to a volcanic hotspot on the ocean floor that pushed a mountain of lava up from a base more than 4,000 meters below the surface. The volcano eventually went extinct, but the story didn't end there. Over millions of years, coral reefs grew around its submerged summit, and the shells and skeletons of countless marine organisms settled and compacted into a thick cap of limestone, nearly 60 meters deep in places, that now forms the entire visible surface of the island chain. That limestone is beautiful. It's also the exact reason there's no fresh water anywhere on the surface. The rock is so porous that rain simply sinks straight through it within minutes, disappearing underground before anyone can catch a drop.
Nature handed this place a stunning foundation and then quietly took away the one resource every human settlement actually needs to survive. Picture a young carpenter from that shipwrecked crew, a man we'll call Nathaniel, standing on the beach that first night with salt water still drying on his clothes, staring up at a sky that had just tried to kill him and was now, absurdly, perfectly clear and full of stars. He'd have known, the way any sailor of his era knew, that survival on an island like this usually came down to finding water within the first few days, or turning back to the sea in makeshift boats and hoping for better luck. There was no better luck available here. What there was, instead, was Cedar, an entire island covered in it, along with wild hogs left behind by earlier Spanish or Portuguese sailors who'd stopped briefly on these same reefs a century earlier without ever settling.
Nathaniel and the other survivors spent the better part of a year on that island, building 2 small ships from the native Cedar to eventually complete their voyage to Jamestown. And in doing so, they proved something that would define the next 4 centuries of this place's story. However hostile the conditions looked on paper, human ingenuity had a way of finding an answer the land itself refused to provide. Not everyone who survived the wreck chose to leave either. A handful of crew members deserted rather than board the newly built ships, preferring an uncertain future on a lonely rock to whatever waited for them back in Jamestown, a colony that was, at that exact moment, suffering through a famine so severe that colonists there had taken to eating shoe leather and, in at least one documented case, each other. Compared to that, a rainless limestone island with abundant fish, wild hogs, and cedar for shelter didn't look nearly so grim. Nathaniel himself eventually sailed on to Virginia with the rest, and whatever became of him afterward, his real legacy was simpler and more durable than any single fate. He'd helped prove a hostile rock in the middle of nowhere could actually sustain human life, which is exactly the information the next wave of colonists needed to justify coming back on purpose. Word of the shipwreck and the island's surprising livability spread quickly once survivors reached Virginia, and by 1612, the same company backing the Jamestown colony had sent official settlers to formally claim what they named, after one of the fleet's admirals, the Somers Isles, though the older name, taken from an earlier Spanish sailor named Juan de Bermudez, stuck far more firmly in everyone's mouth. Those first official colonists faced the exact same fundamental problem Nathaniel's crew had faced years earlier. There was still no fresh water source anywhere on the island, and any permanent settlement was going to have to solve that problem or die trying. The solution they eventually settled on wasn't a single invention so much as generations of quiet, stubborn observation, refined slowly enough that nobody could point to one specific year it was invented. Builders began constructing roofs out of the same porous limestone the island was made of, but cut into thin, overlapping stepped slabs, coated with a lime-based whitewash and angled to channel every drop of rain that fell across their stepped surface down into gutters and then into a stone cistern buried beneath the house. Picture a mason we'll call Josiah, working sometime in the early 18th century, cutting limestone slabs by hand and setting them in careful overlapping rows across a roof frame, testing each course by pouring a bucket of water across it and watching where it pooled, correcting the pitch until every drop ran cleanly toward the gutter, instead of collecting anywhere it might crack the stone during the next hard freeze or hurricane. He wasn't working from a blueprint, he was working from decades of trial and error, passed down from builders before him, refining a system that would eventually become so essential to survival on the island that it was written directly into law. To this day, every new home built here is legally required to include a water catchment roof and a cistern sized to match its footprint. The white colour of those roofs wasn't chosen for looks either, even though it's become one of the most photographed details of the entire island. White limestone reflects the brutal subtropical sun, keeping both the collected water and the house beneath it cooler, while the sheer weight of stacked stone slabs compared to a light shingle roof gives the whole structure a fighting chance against hurricane winds that arrive with brutal regularity every summer and autumn. A roof on this island was never simply something you built to keep rain out. It was the entire water supply for a household, hiding in plain sight above everyone's head. The math behind that system is stricter than most visitors realize. Local building regulations still require every roof to be sized, so its catchment area, combined with the underground cistern beneath it, can supply enough water for the household through the driest stretches of the year. And homeowners genuinely do watch weather forecasts, the way farmers elsewhere watch them for rain on their crops. Because a dry autumn here doesn't just mean a browner lawn, it can mean rationing showers and hauling in expensive trucked water until the tanks fill back up. Even now, with modern desalination plants supplementing the supply for hotels and larger developments, most private homes still rely primarily on the same roof and cistern system Josiah and builders like him refined by hand centuries ago. Which makes this one of the rare places on Earth where a piece of 17th century engineering never got replaced. It just got quietly perfected. Solving the water problem let the colony survive its first difficult decades, but it didn't make the place wealthy, and the labour that built those early roofs and cleared that early farmland wasn't entirely free. Like almost every English colony of this period, the settlement imported enslaved Africans, alongside indentured servants and a smaller number of enslaved and displaced indigenous people from the American mainland, to work the tobacco fields, quarry the limestone, and eventually crew the ships that would come to define the island's economy. By the early 18th century, enslaved people made up a substantial share of the total population, and it's worth being direct about that, rather than letting the postcard version of this island's history quietly skip past it. Out of that forced labour, and out of the deep human need to preserve some form of cultural memory and artistic expression under conditions designed to strip both away, came a tradition that still defines the island's identity today. A masked, drumming, dancing performance known as Gombey, blending West African rhythm and movement with elements borrowed from British military band traditions and indigenous costume influences, performed by troops wearing elaborate peacock feather headdresses and full-face masks that originally served a very practical purpose. The masks hid the identity of the dancers from enslavers who viewed the tradition with deep suspicion, occasionally banning it outright or restricting performances to a single day each year out of fear that a masked, drumming crowd might be organising something more dangerous than dance. For long stretches of the island's history, Gombey was survival disguised as celebration.
Today, it's performed openly, joyfully, on street corners and at festivals. And the fact that it survived centuries of suppression to become a proud public symbol of the island's culture says something important about which stories actually endure. Picture a boy we'll call Elias, growing up in the mid-20th century in one of the island's black neighbourhoods, learning the drumming patterns and dance steps of his family's Gombey troupe, not from any formal school, but from his uncles and older cousins, practicing in a backyard for months before he was allowed to wear a mask and headdress in public for the first time.
The costumes themselves, hand-sewn and built up over months with layers of ribbon, sequins and real peacock feathers, were often the single most valuable thing a working-class family owned, passed down and rebuilt year after year, a visible, wearable act of pride in a culture that had spent generations being told, directly and indirectly, that it had nothing worth being proud of. When Elias finally stepped out from behind his own mask for the first time, drumbeat rattling in his chest, he wasn't just performing a dance, he was inheriting a form of resistance that had outlasted the very people who once tried to ban it. The island's economy through the 17th and 18th centuries increasingly centred on the sea, and specifically on a distinctive style of sailing vessel that colonists began building from the local Cedar sometime in the late 1600s. The Bermuda sloop, as it came to be known, was lighter, faster, and more manoeuvrable than most European-built ships of the same era, prized for its ability to sail closer to the wind and outrun both storms and, when necessary, other ships entirely. Over the course of the 18th century, island shipbuilders constructed close to 1,000 of these vessels, and island crews used them to haul salt raked from evaporation ponds in the distant Turks Islands back to markets on the American mainland, a trade so profitable that, at its peak, it employed a meaningful share of the entire adult male population, either building ships or sailing them. A place with no farmland worth mentioning and no minerals worth digging for had found its first real export. Speed, skill, and an intimate knowledge of Atlantic winds and currents that most European captains simply didn't have. The Cedar itself deserves a moment of credit here, because the whole industry depended on a tree that turned out to be almost perfectly suited to shipbuilding by accident rather than by design. Bermuda cedar grows dense, resinous, and naturally resistant to the rot and shipworm that destroyed European-built hulls within a few years of tropical service, meaning a sloop built on the island could reasonably be expected to outlast several built from English oak, all while weighing less and needing a smaller crew to sail. Shipwrights felled trees that had sometimes been growing since before the sea venture ever wrecked on the reefs, and by the time the industry peaked in the mid-1700s, so much cedar forest had been cleared for hulls, masts and spars that later generations would spend the better part of 2 centuries watching the island's once dense cedar cover shrink toward near disappearance, a slow-motion trade of forest for fortune that nobody at the time thought to question. That same maritime skill made the island genuinely useful during periods of conflict elsewhere, sometimes in ways its own residents weren't especially proud of after the fact. During the American Civil War, the island became a key staging point for ships attempting to slip past the Union naval blockade of Confederate ports, loading cargoes of weapons and manufactured goods in island harbours before making a fast run for southern coastlines under cover of darkness, and profiting handsomely from cotton smuggled back out in the other direction. It was, by any honest accounting, a small island making a very large amount of money by helping prolong a war fought substantially over slavery. A contradiction that sits uncomfortably alongside a place whose own culture was so profoundly shaped by the descendants of enslaved people. History rarely offers a place the luxury of a single, uncomplicated identity, and this one is no exception. Picture a blockade runner captain we'll call Obadiah, easing his fast, low-slung steamship out of the island's main harbour on a moonless night in 1863. Engines throttled back to reduce the telltale plume of smoke, running dark toward a Confederate port hundreds of kilometres away, with a hold full of rifles, medicine and manufactured goods that southern factories could no longer produce under blockade. The profits on a single successful run could be extraordinary, sometimes enough to cover the cost of the ship itself several times over. And island merchants who financed these voyages grew wealthy fast enough to build some of the grander houses still standing in the capital today. It was, without question, a lucrative business. It was also, without question, aiding a war effort built on preserving slavery. And the moral discomfort of that fact doesn't disappear just because the blockade-running captains themselves rarely thought much about the cause they were profiting from. They were watching currency, not conscience, and the harbour didn't ask questions about cargo as long as the money cleared. The 20th century brought a different kind of foreign entanglement, this time entirely by agreement rather than blockade running. In 1941, with Britain desperately needing warships to survive the early years of the Second World War, the British and American governments struck a deal that traded aging American destroyers for long-term leases on British military bases scattered across the Western Hemisphere, and a significant naval and air base on the island's western end was part of that arrangement.
Thousands of American servicemen were stationed there through the war and for decades afterward, reshaping the local economy, introducing new consumer goods and cultural influences, and leaving behind, after the base finally closed in 1995, hundreds of acres of former military land that the island has spent the years since converting into parkland, an airport expansion, and new housing. That American presence changed daily life in ways both large and small. Local shops began stocking American brands of cigarettes, chewing gum, and canned food that had never been available before. Island musicians picked up new styles from servicemen, homesick for the swing and early rock and roll, playing on bass radio. And a small but permanent number of marriages between American servicemen and local women created family ties across the Atlantic that some island households still trace today. It also brought friction.
Segregation policies that many of the American servicemen had grown up with clashed, sometimes violently, with the island's own more informally structured but still deeply unequal racial hierarchy, and the presence of a large foreign military garrison on a small island inevitably raised uncomfortable questions about who really controlled the place during those decades. When the base finally closed for good in 1995, it marked the end of the longest continuous foreign military presence in the island's history, more than 3.5 centuries after the sea venture first ran aground on the reefs a few kilometers from where the runway now sat. The pink sand itself, one of the island's most photographed features, turns out to have a small, strange story behind it too. For years, visitors assumed the colour came from crushed coral, but the actual source is a microscopic red-shelled organism called Homotrema rubrum that lives attached to the reefs offshore. When parrotfish graze on the reef and crush these tiny shells along with everything else they eat, the fragments get ground down and mixed into the surrounding white sand. And over enough centuries, that steady, patient grinding is what tints entire beaches a soft shade of pink. It's a fitting little metaphor for the island as a whole, honestly. Something that looks purely decorative at first glance turns out, on closer inspection, to be the product of an entire ecosystem quietly grinding away at itself for a very long time.
By the mid-20th century, tourism had become the island's most visible industry. Its pink sand beaches and turquoise water drawing American and European visitors in growing numbers every year. But the industry that would eventually make this small island genuinely, extraordinarily wealthy was something far less photogenic: insurance, and specifically the reinsurance business, the layer of financial protection that insurance companies themselves buy to survive catastrophic, once-in-a-generation losses. The island's transformation into a reinsurance powerhouse began in earnest in the 1960s and 1970s, when American companies started incorporating offshore units here to take advantage of favorable tax treatment and light-touch regulation. And it accelerated dramatically after major disasters like Hurricane Andrew in 1992 and the September 11th attacks in 2001 exposed massive gaps in global disaster coverage that a wave of newly formed island-based reinsurers rushed in to fill.
Picture an actuary we'll call Diane, moving to the island in the 1990s to work for one of these newly formed reinsurance companies, spending her days modelling the statistical probability of hurricanes striking cities she's never visited and earthquakes shaking regions on the other side of the planet, calculating exactly how much a global insurance giant should pay for protection against disasters that, on any given year, will almost certainly not happen, but that would be financially catastrophic if they did. Her office, like most of the industry's offices, sits in a low-rise, pastel-coloured building in the capital, because local building codes still cap construction height at the level of the nearby Cathedral Tower, meaning an island managing well over $1 trillion in global risk exposure does it from buildings that would look modest in almost any mid-sized American suburb. Today, this single island accounts for more than a third of the world's entire catastrophe reinsurance market, an industry built entirely on managing risk that exists somewhere else, generated by a population smaller than a single mid-sized American high school district. That transformation didn't happen purely by accident. Island regulators spent decades deliberately courting the industry, streamlining incorporation rules, building a stable and predictable legal system based on English common law that global insurers could trust, and maintaining a tax structure attractive enough that forming a subsidiary here made straightforward financial sense for companies that would otherwise have paid substantially more elsewhere. Critics abroad have periodically accused the island of functioning as a tax haven that lets wealthy corporations avoid contributing fairly to the countries where they actually generate most of their revenue. And it's a fair criticism that island officials have spent just as many decades pushing back against, arguing that genuine economic substance, real offices, real employees, real risk modelling expertise sets their industry apart from a shell company registered purely on paper. Both arguments have real substance behind them, and the debate over exactly where legitimate financial competition ends and harmful tax avoidance begins is one that international regulators and the island's own government are still actively negotiating today, particularly as global minimum tax agreements have started closing some of the advantages that fueled the industry's original growth. None of that wealth erased the island's older, stranger customs, and in some cases, it simply absorbed them into its modern professional culture. British military officers stationed here in the late 19th century, struggling with the subtropical heat in full wool uniforms, began having their trousers cut off at the knee. And by the 1920s, local businessmen in the capital had adopted a civilian version of the style, paired with a dress shirt, blazer, tie, and knee-high socks as legitimate office attire. It has never really gone out of fashion since. Government ministers, bank executives, and reinsurance actuaries alike still show up to formal meetings in tailored shorts, and it remains one of the only places on Earth where a grown man in knee socks and a blazer is, without irony, considered sharply dressed for a business meeting. Even the island's premier and members of its parliament have shown up to formal government business dressed this way, and rather than undermining anyone's authority, the style has become a quiet point of national pride, a small act of confidence that says a place doesn't need to copy London or New York's idea of seriousness in order to be taken seriously itself. Daily life on the island reflects its scale in ways that would feel almost impossible to import anywhere larger. Since 1951, local law has restricted each household to owning a single private vehicle, and visitors have never been permitted to rent cars at all, a restriction introduced decades before most of the world had begun seriously discussing traffic congestion or car dependency.
As a result, the dominant sound on the island's narrow, winding roads isn't engine noise, but the buzz of small motor scooters weaving between low stone walls and pastel-coloured cottages, carrying commuters who might wave to 3 or 4 people they recognise by name during a 10-minute ride to work. It's a small enough place that most residents have known each other in one form or another since childhood, and that familiarity shapes everything from local politics to how quickly news of a problem or a birth or a death spreads from one end of the island to the other. Beneath the surface, though, the island keeps its own hidden geography too. More than 300 documented shipwrecks rest on the reefs and seafloor surrounding it, the accumulated toll of centuries of ships that misjudged these same coral formations the way the Sea Venture nearly did. And divers now visit wrecks that once represented total disaster for the sailors aboard them, exploring cannon and hull timbers that coral has spent decades quietly reclaiming as its own. Inland, meanwhile, slow-dripping rainwater has spent tens of thousands of years carving through softer pockets of the same limestone that makes up the roofs overhead, hollowing out cave systems lined with pale stalactites and clear underground pools that few of the island's original colonists ever knew existed beneath their own feet. The island above the waterline tells one story. The island below it, in wrecks and caverns alike, has been quietly writing its own version the entire time. None of this comes without real cost, and it would be dishonest to end this story pretending otherwise. Every manufactured good, most food, and virtually all fuel has to be shipped in across enormous distances, keeping the cost of living punishingly high for the people who actually live and work here full-time rather than visiting for a week. Land is fixed and finite in a way it simply isn't for larger countries, which means housing is scarce and expensive by almost any global standard, and younger residents often find themselves competing directly against well-paid international finance workers for the same limited pool of apartments, a tension that shows up regularly in local elections and newspaper editorials alike. And the same Atlantic that built the island's early shipping economy also aims its most violent hurricanes directly at it every single season, a risk that climate scientists increasingly believe will only intensify as sea levels rise and storm patterns shift over the coming decades.
A place whose entire modern economy is built on calculating other people's catastrophic risk is itself sitting directly in the path of one. The irony isn't lost on the people who actually live there, and it hasn't gone unaddressed either. Newer construction codes now require even stricter roof anchoring and storm shutters than a generation ago, and the same actuaries who spend their working hours modelling hurricane damage in Florida or the Philippines go home every evening to houses built to the exact same defensive standards they help set for the rest of the world. It's worth pausing here on a connection to another story this channel has already told, because the through line is closer than it first appears. Just 3 years after those first official settlers arrived on these reef-locked shores in 1612, a very different kind of English colony was struggling through its own first brutal winters, 1,000 kilometers to the northwest, in a rocky harbour town that would eventually become Boston. Both settlements were founded on land that offered almost nothing in the way of easy agricultural wealth. Both depended on the sea and on shipbuilding rather than farmland to survive their first difficult decades. And both eventually turned geographic isolation into genuine economic advantage rather than treating it as a permanent handicap. New England built its fortune on trade routes and eventually on finance centered in its own harbour city. This island built its fortune on trade routes and eventually on finance centered on a harbour city of its own, just further out into the open Atlantic than almost anywhere else people have ever chosen to permanently live. Both places, centuries apart in founding, but oddly similar in temperament, ended up proving the same stubborn point. A coastline with no farmland worth mentioning doesn't have to mean a dead end. Sometimes it just means the fortune is going to arrive by ship instead of by plough. Ask people who were actually born and raised here why they stay, despite the cost of living, despite the hurricanes, despite a rock that offered their ancestors nothing but limestone and cedar, and refused for centuries to give up a single drop of fresh water without a fight. And the answer rarely has much to do with money at all. It has to do with a bicycle ride to school that takes exactly 6 minutes and passes 4 people who know your name. It has to do with an ocean that has never really felt like a wall keeping them apart from the rest of the world, but more like a long driveway connecting them to it. One they've been navigating with unusual skill since the day the Sea Venture's survivors first built 2 small ships out of cedar and refused to let a shipwreck be the end of their story. Whatever the actuaries in those pastel-coloured offices calculate about the risk of the next major storm, the people who actually live here have already made their calculation generations ago. And it has never really changed. However hard the wind blows, and however dry the rock beneath their feet, this is still, unmistakably, home.